Hello, everybody. I found my mic so we have sound. I hope everybody's having a lovely Tuesday. I've got something interesting to show you guys today. We're gonna do some math because I like math. So, without further ado, I'm gonna have a seat and then we're gonna do some drafting. So when you're matching your pattern, there's a few things you need to be aware of. And on your pattern, you're looking for the very first thing you want to do is figure out what your base repeat is. Depending on how the fabric is structured, you might have a directional fabric like this one, where all the objects are pointing in the same direction. So on here, all of our barbershop utensils are all roughly in lines, all roughly pointing the same direction. So we don't have scissors pointing backwards. They're all opening towards me right now. So on here, your base repeat, you can kind of map it out based on, you'll need one of these in this size, one of these in this size, one of these, and you might just have to start, oh, I should have grabbed, I'll just fold this. So narrowing it down, this repeat is a little bit different. So as you get it smaller, you will find that from here to roughly there, we'll have one comb, one big red one. So what we're looking for is the very base size, like the smallest size we could go for this repeat without having two of everything. This print happens to be little offset. So we might find that that's going to change how we need to pattern match this. Because this is the same as this. So this print has moved upward and offset slightly. In that case, our base units are stacked. I could do that with a darker pen for you guys. The base individual prints in this are offset at an angle from each other, which means at some point they're going to get back and be lined up again further down the line. So it might be something like this. So starting here, that looks like it's flush with that one and that one line up. So then the bigger unit here might be this to here. And there's going to be a repeat this direction as well. Kind of making sense? Trying to find the smallest unit possible. And here it happens to be a really little one that is offset bigger. But you can look for those little unique items. So finding that very first piece of information, where is your base unit repeat? What is your repeat across the width of your fabric? It's going to vary immensely between fabrics. Some are going to repeat really, really obviously, and others are not. Some are going to be a bit of a puzzle to solve. I like puzzles. This is why we're doing this. So this one is going to match up kind of that way. So when you've got two pieces that you need to join, the things you're going to need to take into account is where those repeats are happening. And you still need room to sew these together. Looking at 1, 2, 3 of our colored barbershop holes. This is an easy place to keep track of. So what we'll need to find on our second piece is 3 barbershop holes that match those. And this was cut from the other half. These are 2 fat quarters. So looks to me like this and this, this and this, this and this are going to match up. And ideally what's going to happen when you overlap these is if you do this right, all the way across, you're going to have something that looks nearly seamless and pattern matched through all those objects that are offset in between. But this is what we're aiming for, so that it looks seamless when you sew this together. And it looks seamless at every single object, all the way across. From this line, if I was to have this as my finished seam line, once you know where that pattern repeat is happening and where you want to join these, you need to cut based on your seam allowance that you're going to sew with. So if we're looking at this object and we know we want from here to be matched like this, our seam line needs to land right in that spot on both those fabrics, and we still need a seam allowance. So if you're to flip this back, we don't need all this extra fabric in here, but we do need a reasonable seam allowance. So if you're quilting, you're probably used to using 1/4 inch seam allowances. And what you'll do from here is mark that 1/4 inward on both those fabrics. So seam line, 1/4 inch inward, and then you can trim all of that spot. I would mark this with a wash away pen, and then I would match it all 2 or 3 times and baste it before I commit to actually sewing it together on something this small and detailed. For something this detailed, if you were trying to pattern match, there's pins, there's fancy glues, precision piecing glue where you can iron and glue at the same time. It would be really useful in a place like this where you're trying to pattern match really little objects. They're going to be really obvious if they're off. And it'll be a much cleaner look than this, which is what you would get if you just whacked your fabric together. Definitely if you're using that beigey colored thread that would blend well with this, that would be awesome. Okay, so little tiny objects, they're going to take you more work because there's just less room for error on a 1/2 inch size barbershop pole. So finding the repeat is your first step. After that, you'll need to figure out where you want that seam to land, and that'll probably be dictated based on how much fabric you have and how much wiggle room you have. But most of us wouldn't want to leave a 3-inch chunk of extra if we could get that tighter in and then have useful fabric at the end. So that fabric's a good start. Then how to find pattern matching on something a little bigger. Where's your pattern repeat on something bigger? So this one, you'll have to make friends with your fabric. You'll have to pet it a little to find your pattern repeats. This particular fabric has little purple flowers with little green stems all in a bunch, and purple flowers with green stems not in a bunch. So those are 2 distinct flowers. At first glance, they look nearly the same, but they're both distinct, and they repeat in the same sequence about here to here. And on something with a bigger, bolder print like this, you might actually have to look at the whole piece all the way across, but usually that's a good indicator. Pick one really distinct object and count how far it until it happens again. So the other really easy one to figure out and look at here, bright pink flower, bright pink flower. So how far apart are those? Will give you a rough idea of where that repeat is for you. So this repeat is roughly 12 inches. And you can confirm that across a couple more objects. So this peachy colored and white flower, 12 inches between the same part of both those flowers again. From the purple flower we looked at first to the bottom of the other purple flower that matches it, 12 inches. And this again is a directional print. So if you were trying to pattern match, you have 12 inches here, that'll match the 12 inches here. So that's a good start. And then if you wanted to make this bigger, you would have to figure out your pattern repeat this direction as well. And that's where you need to look at more fabric. Some of these fabrics might repeat across the bolt and some of them may not. Across the width of this fabric, these two flowers are here. They're offset and down a little bit when you get over here. So this print there is a repeat. It's not as distinct this direction, but it does give you some different options as far as pattern matching across width-wise. So if you wanted these flowers going up your drapes, you would need to account for where that pattern should land when it gets to the other edge of your fabric over here versus at that edge. Usually if you want a pattern match, buy way more fabric. No hard, fast rule until you do the math. You could do what I do and just buy the whole bolt. It's one way of doing things. Other places that you need to be aware of repeats is things like stack and whack quilts, which is a whole nother day of cutting fabric apart in interesting ways. First step, find where those repeats happen, find where they happen, and then you're going to need to pick how and where you want those to join. Because there's going to be a way that's going to be more economical fabric-wise than another. And it's not necessarily going to be super obvious your first couple times doing it. These two purple flowers again, repeated here, offset, and the place to sew those together would be through here. And really, I would base this before cutting it down. Long, loose stitch, it'll be easy to make sure that you've got it right. Because the measure twice, cut once rule of carpentry should apply here. Unless you're really, really sure of yourself. But the first couple times, you're probably not going to be sure of yourself. So by all means, baste your pieces together and use way more pins than you think. Because you don't, if this is precious fabric that you've hoarded for a long time, for a special project, for a special person, you would like to have it bang on. And that should be about there. But when you're looking at that, if that was on a quilt back and your pattern matched properly, you wouldn't be able to see that seam. It would disappear. So big, bold patterns, they work differently. Stripes are going to pattern match in similar ways. So this is the bolt I bought the whole bolt of because I knew that my neurotic husband would want it to be pattern matched across the backing. And it's a very big print. And it doesn't repeat across the fabric. It only repeats along the bolt. So the repeat on this one, I did the math the other morning when I was fresh. It was early. The repeat on this one is 0.6 of a meter. So it's a really big repeat. And to get this to pattern match the way I wanted it to pattern match, I needed to match, this is for a quilt back, so it's going to match all the way across the quilt, just following the repeat on the bolt. But I also need, this is going on a very, very big periodic table quilt. So I also needed enough to load it on the long arm and pattern match the other direction. So when I'm looking at my repeats going width of fabric wise, this middle line, there's 5 units and they don't repeat. So I need a whole nother repeat of that fabric. But the other thing I noticed on here is that all these circles are about 1 inch apart. So when I start to put this together, I need to account for, I don't want my bolt sides to match. I don't want a 3-inch gap over here. I still want a 1-inch gap before my next circle. So calculating that in to how much fabric I needed more fabric. It just happened. So for this, if I'm using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and matching these at 1 inch apart. I actually need to cut these at 3/4 of an inch outside the edge of these circles, so that I have 3/4 of an inch, 1/4 inch is going to be my seam allowance, and then I have 1/2 inch and another 1/2 inch to add up to the 1 inch gap between these circles. This is where our pattern math comes in. What's the distance you need between those pieces for that repeat? And work backwards from there, adding seam allowance in. So if you know you need 1 inch, you know it's going to be split over 2 pieces. In half is usually easier. And then in half, that'll be your seam line, and then add your seam allowance to that afterwards. Clear as mud? It's an art. No, it's math. It's really just math. And getting out your sketch paper and basting and trying this is what I would do. You're going to figure out where you want your seam line and add your seam allowance. Once you have that pattern repeat that you want to land on. So seam line, and then if this is our pattern with circles, we want those to be circular, not big weird ovals. You need to add the seam allowance to both sides, to both pieces. That's roughly what we're aiming for. And I can tell you right now, I need 3 meters, which is 6 repeats, 5 repeats of this pattern to go across the backing of my quilt, the way we're going to load it on the long arm. And if you are making a backing for your long armor, or us as your long armor, be generous. So get more than you need. You can always use those offcuts for scraps and other things. And don't be afraid to try pattern matching. But again, we all have seam rippers. Just don't cut it until you're sure, is the other way around that. That's what we're doing today. Pattern match all the fun things. Make your quilt backs look that much more professional. Or your drapes. Or your duvet covers. Whatever you're making. Thanks for joining me, guys. Be safe, be kind, be calm, and we will see you next time.